All right, so just to finish up Mark's presentation really quick, the next step that BLE would take would be to prepare a report in accordance with the Georgia Geologic Survey Circular 14 criteria for performing site acceptability studies for solid waste landfills in Georgia. The last slide that Mark had, this is a picture of a typical drill rig taking samples at a similar site, and that's the type drill rig that sat out there for months as we gathered the samples. So going to change gears a little bit on you and talk a little bit about the engineering parameters that the team looked at going forward. So first I want to talk just briefly about permits and approvals for municipal solid waste landfills in Georgia and really the country. So pre-1990 we buried all our waste in the ground, and the waste we're talking about is the waste that we all throw away at our households. And so in 1990 or so, the Environmental Protection Agency issued a set of regulations that set forth minimum measures that must be required to construct an MSW landfill. The rules that we refer to in my business is called Subtitle D regulations. EPA also allowed the states to develop their own programs if they wanted to, as long as that program was at least as stringent as the federal rule. Georgia elected to do that, along with many states, so they have their own program, and it's administered through the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. That allows Georgia to focus on regional concerns that are important to Georgians, that are unique to our state. So as we go through the process, certain approvals and permits are needed in order to permit and operate a landfill in the state of Georgia. The first is local approval, which is why we're here today. Those local approval processes, as you understand, we're going through right now. Once we get through the local approval processes, you'll be seeking a redundant set of permits that overlap. We refer to them as nesting permits. So I'll go through a few of those just here in just a second about the permits and how they affect one another. The first is the Georgia Solid Waste Handling Permit, and there's two parts to that. The first is before you can even get a permit, the site has to be determined suitable by the state of Georgia. I ended Mark's presentation by saying that he would have to submit a report for suitability. That's it. So he submits it, the state of Georgia approves it suitable, and they'll list specific conditions unique to this site that the facility must be permitted under. We call that site suitability determination. Once you get that, you move forward with a EPD solid waste handling permit application. That application will be bigger than the one in front of you. It will have 40 or 50 plan sheets plus lots and lots of other calculations that go with that. The EPD solid waste handling permit will be issued by the director of Georgia EPD, and it'll include things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but the major components: operational conditions, acceptable waste, waste screening, groundwater methane stormwater reporting and monitoring, closure and post-closure, and something called financial assurance I'll touch on in just a second, annual, quarterly, monthly, and semi-annual monitoring, and who gets that, how stormwater will be managed, what surveying requirements are required, what kind of leachate handling procedures we have. Leachate is the water that touches waste or comes out of the waste that manages wastewater, and the construction quality assurance requirements that I'll touch on in just a second about how all that comes together. That's one permit. The next permit we'll have to get after that is what's called an EPD Title V air permit, and these permits overlap one another. So there's another permit. That air permit will specify the requirements for the air emissions from the site. The next will be at least two stormwater permits, one for construction activity and one for operational or industrial activity for the site, also issued by the state. We have local permits such as health department permits and building permits, and local erosion sedimentation control permits that will have to be obtained and complied with. We'll also have EPD surface mining permits. As we mentioned before, the Barra area soils, those mine areas, which will be really just subdued topography of this particular site, have to be the way they're developed, the way they're mined, and most importantly, how they're reclaimed. That's all part of a permit that's administered by EPD. And landfill gas, it's very common now that landfill gas has a beneficial reuse. So pretty well most big sites that have landfill gas projects are going to beneficial reuse type systems. So if that does develop at this facility, we'd have to get gas to energy permits as well. The next piece we talk about is now that we know how the permits are nested together and they overlap, is the ultimate engineering design. And so this applicant, Solid Solutions, they elected to go ahead and bring all the experts to the table first. And so these experts come in and their expertise, they look at this facility so that we can develop the location of the landfill portion of this application, that we can develop it appropriately. A few of these experts that were brought in were geotechnical and hydrogeologic professionals and engineers, civil engineers, noise, odor, traffic experts, solid waste engineers, structural engineers, floodplain and stormwater routing specialists, surveyors, air quality experts. All of these were engaged up front. And so the way that works is here comes the professional, they look at this site, they develop their criteria, and we repeat the design process over and over and over again until we get the best location on the site. All that's been done. Many of those reports are in the application that you see in front of you, and several of the things that we look at there are the geotechnical strength, the stability of the facility, the constructability, the operation, how it's going to be put together, how it's going to be phased, how are we going to access it, what kind of contingency planning do we need for weather events or otherwise, how's the stormwater going to be managed, stored, and sampled, what kind of groundwater and methane systems and monitoring system and detection systems are going to be put in place. All those are just a few. That was done, repetitive process. I can tell you the location and the footprint of the landfill was revised accordingly. This application changed accordingly based on those experts. And then as part of that, you end up with a system where all the experts are okay with what we've done. It meets their criteria, and we move forward to the next system, which is the main components of the landfill. Next slide, please. So the first main component of the landfill is what we call the landfill liner system. I mentioned before that we've already determined a seasonal high groundwater elevation for preliminary design purposes. The base liner system is separated by a certain amount of separation from seasonal high groundwater. We call that compacted subgrade. Then on top of that is at least a minimum 2-foot thick layer of compacted soil liner, clay liner. That's a specific type of material that's on site, that's put in a specific way, that's tested a specific way, reported a specific way. On top of that, you have what we call a geosynthetic clay liner. That is a dry bentonite clay encapsulated between two fabrics. The purpose of that is a redundant system. You'll find that engineers are redundant. We like systems that act as backup to each other, that aren't related to each other. So the way this works is a geosynthetic clay liner sits up underneath the HDPE flexible membrane liner. Should there ever be a hole developed in the HD membrane liner, it wets that clay. Clay swells when it gets wet, it plugs the hole. On top of that is the primary liner system, which is the high density polyethylene membrane liner. It is manufactured for this purpose. It's at least 60 mils thick. It's put down in a certain way. We'll talk about that in just a second. On top of that is what we call a cushion geotextile. Does exactly what it sounds like. Acts as a cushion. It protects the liner from the material on top. On top of that is what we call a protective cover system. Does what it sounds like. It protects the liner system. It sits on top of the cushion. This applicant has elected to not only to go ahead and specify what this protective cover system would be. They've selected a stone system, which is probably the most expensive, but imagine stone down there at the bottom of the landfill. It's not going to go anywhere, and it acts as not only protective cover, but it also acts as a leachate conveyance system. In addition to that, you have pipes in the bottom of the landfill that drain to small, maybe 10 or 15 acres at a time sumps. So you have liquid that's being able to be conveyed through this and through the pipe. There's a redundant system. So that's the base liner system and how it works, and the municipal solid waste goes up on top. Next slide, please. All right, we essentially, at the end of the landfill facility, we do what we call a close as you go. We take the base liner system and we replicate it on top. Same types of materials, they do the same thing. We want to make sure that we minimize water infiltration through the landfill. So you have a cap system that controls stormwater on top, have the same types of membrane liners, et cetera, on top, for the sole purpose of ensuring that we store waste in what we call a dry environment or a dry entombed environment. You want to minimize stormwater coming into the waste over the long-term life of the facility. I will mention briefly that T touched on it, but all liquid from the bottom of the landfill is collected in what we call sumps. They're located right here. This facility is designed with relatively small acres draining to each sump. So maybe 10 or 15 acres at the most go into individualized sumps. And these are monitored daily to ensure all the liquid is coming off the liner. Essentially, if you don't want anything to have the potential to leak, you just remove the water. And so that's what these sumps are designed to do. Also critical to recognize that each one of these facilities here each one of these liner systems has to be constructed under the watchful eye of a CQA engineer, construction quality assurance, that uses his expertise, puts his engineering seal on it. He is third party to make sure that these systems are not only designed, but they're constructed and tested in the field when they go in so that they're correct. The next piece I'd like to touch on is the closure, post-closure. So when the landfill is fully constructed and you have to have money at the end of the facility to close it. So how does that work? Well, the Solid Solutions in this case, every ton of waste that goes into the landfill facility, they have to set aside a certain amount of money to close it. Those financial models are done every year, and they also have to maintain it for at least 30 years afterwards. So they set aside a certain amount of money for every ton of waste that goes in the landfill for something we call closure, post-closure. Now, we won't be redundant. The state also requires that the applicant put forth a financial assurance mechanism that's issued in favor of the state. Could be a bond, could be another mechanism, but essentially it's a bonding mechanism that should anything ever occur, the state can close the landfill and do post-closure on it. So 2 buckets of money aimed at the same purpose, and both of them can cover the cost. Next is enforcement. You may ask, all right, well, how, we have all these permits, how are they enforced? Well, each permit I mentioned before, that regulatory agency has an enforcement arm. So EPD has enforcement arms out of Atlanta. They have local enforcement arms. So the permits are the facility's license to do business. If they cannot comply with their permits, enforcement comes. It looks like this. Inspections are generally every quarter or so. They're looking for compliance. If they can't find compliance, they'll issue a deficiency. If it's serious, they'll issue a violation, which will quickly lead to a consent order and a fine. And if they cannot comply with the permits, the state will simply pull the permit, which stops the landfill. And you may ask if that's ever been done. Yes, the state of Georgia has shut down landfills before for lack of compliance. So there is an enforcement arm part of that. It's also important to realize these permits are not stagnant. Every permit we've got about every 5 to 10 years has to be renewed for change in technology. So every permit that you get is going to be renewed every 5 or 10 years at the state, federal level. The last 2 pieces I'm going to touch on are odor and noise. Next slide, please. So the applicant hired a odor expert out of the Northeast. We worked with him a couple of times before, and he developed a worst case model for odor. He set the threshold, a conservative threshold of hydrogen sulfide, and the reason he picked hydrogen sulfide is that's detectable at really low levels. He could have picked other things, but he picked hydrogen sulfide because it's detectable at a really low level. He set the threshold for the worst case model at 10 parts per billion, which is this green line here. And you can see in the worst case, and this is potential, this is just the potential, worst case potential, you can see that potential is on lands either controlled or owned as part of the applicant or in naturally wooded buffers that are not part of any residential development. He also made several recommendations that are in your application that you see for how to make sure the facility maintains a potential much lower than that. These include exclusion of special waste types, which T covered briefly, additional buffer controls, which are already incorporated in, limit water infiltration by temporary covers and exposed geosynthetics, and a close-as-you-go process, which are already in the application in front of you today. The last study I'd like to touch on is the noise potential study. Next slide, please. Same thing, develop a noise study that is conservative. The conservative model they picked was a 55 decibel level, which we're talking at about 60 decibels. Normal conversations about 60 decibels. They did a baseline study, the expert did, that is. He prepared this map. And as you can see if you look in this general range right here, the 55 decibel level is going to be on property that's included in the application, controlled by Solid Solutions, and I believe the consultant's finding was this has a very low potential to violate any of the ordinances for nuisance in the Haralson County noise ordinance. So with that, I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank y'all for having this meeting today and being able to listen to everything that we're trying to explain. If you'll put the next slide up, please. This is Meriwether County, Georgia, which I did. There wasn't a landfill done in Georgia for 15 years before this one was done. And we did it, my company. There hadn't been one since then, which is another 15 years. This site in so many ways resembles what we're doing here in the fact that it's right off the interstate. This one's actually closer to the interstate than this one. Meriwether County, we wanted to make sure that we combine the waste into a smaller area. We introduced the concept of an industrial park, and people thought we were crazy. Nobody wanted to go down there. A big industrial announcement there was of Dollar General, and that nobody would want to build houses. The realtors all came out and said, oh, you're going to destroy property values, you're going to pollute people's wells, you're going to pollute the groundwater, on and on and on. Almost verbatim with the same kind of things that you've heard here. When we talk about, the next slide, when we talk about Haralson County, I think there's several things that are unique about this. One is compatibility of zoning. I've never had another site that, from a compatibility of zoning standpoint, is pretty much surrounded by industrial uses already, with the old county landfill right next to it. And so it sits up perfectly, for what we're trying to do. It sits down in a valley. When you look at the old facility, I think there's several things that you have to keep in mind here. When we talk about and listen to opposition talking about how nobody's going to build next to it, and we're going to poison wells and smell going 5 miles, I want you to think for a minute. This old landfill operated for 40 some odd years. In our research, we haven't found anywhere where the public's out here complaining about the smell of it. Old landfill was built without a liner, without monitoring, without methane gas systems, without leachate. And like most county landfills, there was really no record of what went in there. Now, have any of you heard that the old county landfills poisoned any wells? No. Have you heard the old county landfills poisoning Walker Creek? No. And so now you get a state-of-the-art facility, lined, monitored, inspected constantly, and all of a sudden they're going to poison your wells, destroy your land values, and nobody's going to want to build next to it. Just, it's scare tactics, and we run into this all over the country when we do these facilities. Our facility in Meriwether, they enjoy the benefits of the host agreement that we have there. First quarter last year, their check for that one quarter was $974,000 that went to the county. Here we're proposing the same kind of host agreement, or the general terms of a host agreement. Now that's money that's somewhat mandated by the state government, and others is mandated, not mandated, but that we'd agree to terms to. When you look at when we go through here and we talk about the property value protection program, there's very few houses, if you look at the overall, that surrounds the site here that are within a mile. And those particular houses will fall under the property value protection program. We've got a short little film we want to go through here. This is from Meriwether County. These are actually residents in all of Meriwether County that are on here.
how the Merriweather Industrial Park transformed a community. Ernest Kaufman, along with much of the same Solid Solutions development team that is now proposing a landfill and industrial park for Haralson County, Georgia, developed a similar project for Merriweather County in 2009.
When you're faced with these kinds of decisions, and they're tough, I won't sugarcoat it. They are very difficult decisions for a community to make. You have to follow the science. You have to get the best information you can. You have to do your research. You have to find out about who you're dealing with. You have to determine that they're going to do what they say they're going to do, and not be overcome with fear and the naysayers.
Because what we do is different. It's different from any other landfill developer. But what we like to do is take large tracts of land, put the landfill in the middle of it so it doesn't bother people, and then figure out what you can do around it, such as stream mitigation banks, industrial parks.
One of the benefits of this particular site is the interstate, having interstate access right here. And most of especially the Korean companies, do what you call just-in-time delivery, and they can jump on the interstate and go north or south and get their product to their supplier when they need to. But the people didn't really believe we would ever develop this. They just didn't have faith. There's about 1,000 jobs here right now. And Mando, they have 2 facilities here. And Mando will become the largest industry in Merriweather County when they reach their full capacity. Of the 2 plants, they will have about 1,200 employees total.
Of course, they had to have infrastructure, so we ran a sewer line all the way from Hogansville all the way to the industrial park. Set a couple lift stations, and then ran a water line all the way to the site too.
Many local companies provide ongoing services for the landfill and the industrial park.
Yeah, it's very important because we're 10 minutes away from it, and it's just a great opportunity for us to work close to home.
The difference is transformative. We are finally achieving the growth that we've tried to do for all these years. When I got here, there was a population of 3,000, mostly old and retired or poor or both. We have a whole new set of people that have come to town, younger people, millennials and younger. We're in the process of turning dirt on 400 new rooftops, which is amazing when we're a city of 1,100 rooftops.
And I've had testimonies from people saying, thank you for bringing this industry here because I just bought my first car. And that's what it's all about.
Moms and dads in Harrison County need more jobs close to home. They also need more jobs so their children won't have to leave home.
They've brought jobs to the community, and there's nothing like jobs to grow a place.
If you look at the industrial park here, it fronts on the interstate, and that's where industrial property should be. Industrial parks that generally are not fronting on the interstate, where you don't turn immediately off into it, are not nearly as successful as those that are. Here, you'll be coming in on the landfill road, 500 yards off an interstate, turning in on a private road that has any kind of housing on it, going behind a tall ridge, and then accessing the industrial park there, and then continuing on for over a mile more and accessing the landfill itself. The industrial park, when we looked at it, we had a couple of people that we wanted to make sure were protected. This Gold Creek subdivision, we decided to come in back behind it so that this big ridge right in here will protect it. The lady and her family that lives up here, right here, didn't want to have to come in and look in the back door of an industrial building. And so we are leaving all this intact here. Both of those two are susceptible to being developed if we wanted to develop it. But to us, it's more important to leave up natural barriers to what we have here. In closing, I want to say a couple things. One, keep in mind what your own landfill has done or not done. It hadn't done any of the things that, unfortunately, the people that oppose, no matter what location, is going to be the same thing. It hadn't poisoned people. It hadn't destroyed Walker Creek. And ours certainly isn't going to do that either. Lastly, I've served on planning commissions. I've sat in the seat where you are. I've served on city council. And I know what it's like to go into meetings like this when you've got huge crowds. A lot of these people here are here to learn, and we're glad of that. But, you know, we have met every one of the outlines, every one of the pieces that you have in your own ordinances, we've met. And so, as any elected official or planning, it's hard because you have to sit there and say, okay, if these people have met all of our regulations, then I got to approve it, or you should approve it, as opposed to getting caught up in the emotion of the crowd or lack of emotion. It's a hard place to be. It's not easy. So we thank you for that service. Hugh Bass is coming up next, and Hugh is local here. And I want you to pay attention to the maps that he's going to show you of other landfills. Hundreds of houses, not just a few, hundreds of houses, thousands of houses that are built up right next to the landfill. And so you have to ask yourself, well, if these landfills are poisoning all these people, and if they're so bad, then why are people continuing to build? Why are people moving in there? Why don't I hear news about people getting poisoned and dying from the wells like you do about food poisoning? You don't. Okay? So keep that in mind when you look at this. And be careful about buying into the hysteria of how a facility is going to hurt you.